This is TLV1.
This episode may contain explicit language.
And welcome to the Promise Podcast, brought to you on TLV1, the voice of the city about which renowned physicist Albert Einstein wrote when he visited in February 1923, exactly 95 years to the day ago as we record that, quote, "The city of Tel Aviv made a singularly profound impression on me. The rapidity and energy of this town are so remarkable that Jews refer to it with affectionate irony as our Chicago," end quote. And we are recording today for the very first time ever in Jerusalem, the city about which Einstein wrote on the same trip to the Holy Land, on which he was accompanied and guided by Shlomo Ginsburg Ginosar, the son of Achad Ha'am. He wrote, quote, "I continued into the city with Ginsburg, went down to the temple wall, where dull-minded fellow Jews prayed out loud, their faces turned to the wall, bending their bodies backwards and forwards in a rocking movement. Pitiful sight of people with a past but no present. We then zigzagged through the very dirty city, swarming with all kinds of holy men and members of various races, noisy and strangely oriental," end quote. And I know that it's not a competition between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and I want to be clear that the Promise Podcast has, for more than a month now, recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. We plan to establish an embassy here just as soon as we can get the technical matters under control. But I did just want to say that I never really expected to be taping here. In the event, what brought us to the nation's capital is the opportunity to tape in a command performance sort of way before leaders of the UJA Federation of New York, which is, of course, the largest local philanthropy in the history of the world, and which was conceived by a committee of New York worthies, first convened 102 years ago this month, in February 1916, and hatched a plan of unprecedented ambition to bring under a single roof every Jew, or at least every Jewish organization, committed to helping fellow Jews, which roof they called the Federation for the Support of Jewish Philanthropic Societies of New York City. As one contemporary wrote in 1918 of the Federation, quote, "The entire community has now been welded into a solid unit. There is no division of uptown or downtown or any other division of any sort within the Federation," end quote. This is what would allow the new Federation to address its expansive agenda, quote, "What child-caring institutions will we require? What institutions must be developed or created to care for foundlings? How can cooperation be established between the various Jewish schools and the Department of Education of the city? What plan can be formulated to coordinate all types of job placement and vocational guidance? What plan will be most effective to care for cardiacs? Is it possible to develop a committee for the social care of the Jewish sick? What are the hospital needs? What are the needs with reference to summer recreation, either for a period of 2 weeks or for weekend holidays?" And there's much, much more. And it bears mention that the man who convened the committee that convened the Federation and who served as its first president, the very first president of the Federation, was the great financier Felix M. Warburg, of course, who was among the first to greet Albert Einstein when he arrived in New York City in 1921 for his very first visit in the New World as part of a fundraising trip that Einstein took with Chaim Weizmann to raise money to create the Hebrew University. 10 years later, in 1931, Warburg wrote a personal check for $50,000 to the quote-unquote Palestine campaign at a dinner in honor of Albert Einstein, all of which is to say, we are honored to be speaking in front of so august a gathering with so august a history in so august a city, which, by the way, recently announced that it plans to build an Einstein Museum on the campus of the Hebrew University, conclusively closing absolutely all the circles at once. With us in this self-same capital city is a woman who, much like Einstein's famous mass energy equation, E = mc², demonstrates daily that her spectacular spectacular energy is a direct function of the great light that she brings into the world. I speak, of course, of Allison Kaplan Sommer. Allison is a columnist for Arts. She's written with elegance, wit, and power for the Jerusalem Post, for the JTA, for the Forward, for the New Republic, for Politico, and for many other of your very best papers and magazines. You've seen her on TV, and you've heard her on the BBC, on NPR, on PRI. After collecting last year's B'nai B'rith World Center Award for journalism recognizing excellence in diaspora reportage, Allison relaxed into a sinecure as a visiting professor at the College of Charleston, from which she has only lately returned to the rough and tumble of Ra'anana. Allison, how are you doing?
Good. I feel pressure to be high energy tonight.
Hear, hear. Also with us in Jerusalem is a man who, like Einstein's cosmological constant, is a bold yet stabilizing force, finely attuned to all that is light, and yet uniquely able to explain all the dark matter that surrounds us. I speak, of course, of Don Futterman. Don is the Israel Program Director of the Moriah Fund. He's the Director of the Israel Center for Educational Innovation, and he writes for Arts. Don, how are you doing?
Well, I'm very excited to be here because I was born in Beth Israel Hospital, where my parents met, and I grew up, spent all of my formative years in Flushing, Queens. So it's nice to be with a landsman here in Jerusalem. These are my people.
If he's going to say that, I'll point out that I was born in Long Island, Jewish, and first lived in Great Neck, where my mom taught at Great Neck South.
And I'm a Yankee fan, even though I grew up in Flushing.
Don, your parents met at the hospital while you were being born?
No, fortunately, they met before that. My father
at the same hospital that later they
was
used.
a surgical resident, and my mother was the night nurse. And my father came in 1 a.m. one night and said to her, "If I was 2 inches taller, I'd ask you out." And a year later, he gave up on growing 2 inches and asked her out anyway. So here we are.
Sweet story. Well, my name is Noah Efron. I don't mean to boast, but I was flying to America last week, and I took off my shoes, as the more lumpen of us proletarians are wont to do. And then while we were reducing altitude towards Israel, I could find exactly one shoe, no less, no more. I got down on my hands and knees, but the second shoe was nowhere to be found. I was 100% sure also I could have sworn that I had worn 2 shoes getting on the plane. So when we landed, I waited until everyone else got off the airplane. Everyone was off the airplane except for the flight attendants and for me. And finally, looking around, I didn't find it. I put on the one shoe and I walked to a flight attendant and I told her pathetically, I said, "I've lost my shoe." And she laughed and she said, "You what?" And then she called up 20 rows to the next flight attendant and said, "Hey, Moti, this guy lost his shoe." And he laughed and said, "You what?" And then he called over another flight attendant to the plane. And soon I was standing, the lone passenger on the airplane, surrounded by flight attendants and then the pilot, all of whom, I must admit, were endlessly amused by the fact that I had only one shoe. Finally, one of them said, "Hey, there's a shoe. Is it yours?" And it was 30 rows ahead of where I had sat. It had been pushed forward by the cart. And I sheepishly put it on and got off the plane. And I don't like to boast because it's not in my nature. It's just not the way that I was raised. But it is a fine feeling to know that finally, deep into middle age, I have learned to carry myself through the world with a sort of quiet dignity. Today, as each week, we have 3 topics of huge, huge importance that we will discuss. But before that, we have this matter that we are following with alert interest and with great concern. It will have escaped the notice of no one that this week we mark the gala opening of the 2018 Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang County, South Korea, an event distinguished in so many ways by, for instance, I'll show you the beautiful new pictograms that they based on the Korean alphabet. All the pictograms of the different sports are based on Korean letters, which is quite lovely. Or there's also the really terrific mascots that they have developed for this event, which is Shuharang, who is a white tiger, and then there's Bandabi, the Asiatic black bear. And from our point of view, though, the most astonishing and important distinguishing feature of the Olympics is the fact that the Pyeongchang Games will include the largest delegation ever sent by Israel to any Winter Olympic Games, including 10 athletes, 1 alpine skier, 1 short track speed skater, 1 skeleton bobsledder, and 7 figure skaters. Now, no doubt, the greatest share of the attention will rightly go to figure skater Oleksiy Bychenko, who in 2016 became the first Israeli ever to medal in a European skating championship when he took the silver in Europe in 2016, and who is now ranked 9th in the world overall in his field. So we'll all be watching him. But tonight I would like to focus on the little observed fact that fully 30% of the Israeli Winter Olympic team was born in the United States, as good-hearted people tend to be, with 20% of them being born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, the first of these is Paige Connor, a 17-year-old daughter of Pittsford, New York, who told reporters that after she failed to make the U.S. Olympic figure skating team, her mom told her for the first time that she, the mom, is in fact a dual citizen with American and Israeli citizenship, which makes Connor a dual citizen, leading her to try out for the Israeli team and to win a place in the pair figure skating competition with her partner, Evgeny Krasnopolsky.
He's not from Boston.
He is not from Boston. He's from the Ukraine. And they will skate, by the way, among other things, to the theme to the movie Schindler's List. Ooh, that's a bold artistic choice. Now, among Connor's figure skating teammates is 24-year-old Amy Buchanan, who, although she, like Connor, has never lived in Israel, and although she, unlike Connor, does not have an Israeli mother, took on Israeli citizenship under the law of return to compete in, and in fact to win, the 2016 Israeli National Figure Skating Championship. She last year moved to Texas to continue her training, and after failing to make the U.S. Olympic skating team again, she received the last berth on the Israeli figure skating team, which, for those cynical listeners for whom an Israeli Winter Olympic team sounds like so much Jamaican bobsleddery, is ranked number 10 around the world. The Israeli figure skating team is ranked number 10 overall. Anyway, here is how Buchanan explained her complicated identity to the Dallas-Fort Worth NBC affiliate.
So my mom's Jewish, and since she's 100% Jewish, makes me 100% Jewish. And so in order for me to be a citizen, as long as your mother's Jewish, you can have dual citizenship with the U.S.
And she's also embraced becoming a citizen of Texas and our Lone Star way of life. Soon, she'll be side by side once again with her Olympic teammates as a proud Israeli, American, and now a Texan.
Proud Israeli, American, and now a Texan. Now, a whole nother story is Buchanan's 27-year-old one-time fellow Bostonian, Oracle programmer and graduate both of MIT, where he played hockey, and the Maimonides School, or MIMO, in Brookline, Massachusetts, A.J. Edelman, who goes by the nickname the Hebrew Hammer, having earlier tried the nickname the Frozen Chosen, only to find that it didn't have that fearsome Bar Kochbatude that he had taught. So he settled on the Hebrew Hammer. Edelman, an Orthodox Jew, long waited to become an Israeli and came here after college, spending a year in yeshiva in Beit Shemesh before deciding that he could best serve his country by learning the somewhat arcane winter sport of skeleton, a terrifying teeny bobsled that travels at speeds of more than 140 kilometers or 85 miles an hour. Of course, there was no one in Israel to teach him how to drive that thing, so he taught himself by watching YouTube videos until he finally crowdfunded a spot in a training camp in Calgary, and in the fullness of time racked up a fine record in international skeleton competitions, which qualified him finally last month at the last minute for the Olympics. Let's listen to A.J. Edelman declaim some sports pablum.
What defines a champion? Someone ordinary striving to accomplish something extraordinary? Or is it overcoming the voices that say it can't be done, won't be done, hasn't been done? Or is it the blood, sweat, and tears he sheds? Or is it the support of the country and the people he represents? I'm A.J. Edelman, Israel's national skeleton athlete.
If not now, then when, indeed. And to you, A.J. Edelman, and to you, Amy Buchanan, and to you, Paige Connor, as well as Yevgeny Krasnopolsky and Oleski Bychenko, Adel Tankova, Vladislav Baikana, Itamar Biran, and perhaps especially the two members of the team who were actually born in Israel, Ronald Zilberberg of Kiryat Shmona and Daniel Samochin of Tel Aviv. We bid you Godspeed and the best of luck. Our hearts are with you. Today, 3 topics. Topic 1, Israel's urban Poorgeoisie. As renowned professor and oral historian Amia Leiblich reveals in a new book her discovery of a previously unrecognized class that she calls the new poor, once middle class, highly educated, and now desperately downwardly mobile. Some say these struggling teachers and therapists and social workers are canaries in a coal mine, and if they are struggling to survive, then our future as a society is imperiled. Others say they're whiny, privileged folk complaining about being deprived of stuff poor people never dreamed of having in the first place. We'll try to figure out what to think about all of this. Topic 2, the Promise Podcast Guide to Purse String Power, as some argue that the time has come for American Jewish philanthropists to give a lesson to learn a lesson from Lysistrata and become savvier at using their checkbooks to affect the sort of political change they want to see here in Israel. And we'll wonder whether the benefits of further politicizing philanthropy outweigh the costs, and more broadly, what sort of charitable giving produces the greatest and most lasting changes for good here. And topic 3, still in all, Israel, as we, 3 people who uprooted our family tree from the very fertile soil of Amtrak's Boston to Washington corridor, to replant those family trees here in a country that we have seen grow more embattled and less confident in our own virtue, and who each have sent our children to serve in an army about which perhaps our ambivalence has grown with time. We will try to puzzle out why this fateful decision of familial dendrology is one that we made and we never unmade, and we will doubtless not unmake tomorrow. But before we listen to any of that, listen to this.
אני יושב ומנגן וזה עושה לי טוב. כל העולם עוצר סוף סוף. אני נושם, אני קיים, אני מתחיל לחיות. מגשים את כל מה שתמיד רציתי להיות. והעולם בוער להבות. תמיד חלמתי שתהיה לי סיבה לשמוח, גם אם לפעמים קשה, אם תיתן לי כוח לשתות את החיים כמו יין, לא לוותר עדיין. תמיד חלמתי
That is a mashup of songs by Eliad Nahum performed by Voka Tikva Ensemble. Voka Tikva is Israel's leading a cappella group, and it calls what it makes social music, combining the voices of peoples from different parts of Israeli society and music that represents different communities, mashing up, for instance, Mozart and Zohar Argov to show that brilliance is found in Sana'a, Yemen, just as surely as it's found in Vienna, Austria. We will be listening to them over the course of the hour. And now it's time for our first discussion. So, Allison, has Professor Amia Leiblich discovered a new class between the proletariat and the capitalists that one might call the urban bourgeoisie?
Perhaps. I think that the term bourgeoisie that you've coined is very punnish. So it's a new book-length study called Voices, the New Poverty in Israel. The scholar is Amia Leiblich. She's made her name with a series of brilliant studies of what some might call narrative psychology. She interviews a great many people from a specific place, time, era, turning point. She's done the kibbutz. She's dealt with prisoners of war, ultra-Orthodox society. So this book she calls The New Poor. Who are the new poor? This, she says, is poverty that is unexpected given the place that those who suffer from it started. The new poor are people who stood on their own 2 feet, The new poor are people who stood on their own 2 feet or who were supposed to stand on their own 2 feet economically, but for some reason the ground withdrew from beneath them. In the U.S., you'd call them the working poor, but what's unique about them is that they're definitely not homeless poor, and they aren't really working class poor either. She describes her subjects as poor folks who have a home, a refrigerator, and a washing machine, but everything is about to fall apart for them. How did she find them? So she runs ads online online and in the newspapers, seeking interviewees who see themselves as suffering from this new poverty. And she defines it in her ads as asking for people who feel that the sentence, "I want to live, not just survive," applies to them. So each of the stories she found is unique, but there are some common threads. They grew up in middle class or upper middle class households, are well educated, some with doctorates even. Many are in helping professors. Many are in helping professions, teachers, therapists, social workers, etc., or in the arts. For many people, their deterioration economically began with a divorce. There's many single parents, especially single mothers, overrepresented in her group. So this leads the reporter to ask the single mother of 2 daughters who works full-time, who cannot afford a laptop for her children or afford to send them with their class on the trip to Poland. That's common for Israeli high school students. Do you define this as poverty? Now, there's plenty of really poor people in Israel. There are 1,800,000 Israelis below the poverty line, among them more than 800,000 kids. 18.6% of Israeli families are poor, and if you talk about population, many of these families, a definition of a family, are in the ultra-Orthodox sector or in the Arab sector, very large families. So if you're talking about individuals, it's going to be an even larger percentage. We have the third worst poverty rate in the OECD, ahead of only Costa Rica and South Africa. So for the most part, Leiblich's new poor, she's not talking about those people. They don't fall below the poverty lines and are not included in these statistics. So people are saying maybe we should worry about these really poor people and not kind of these whiny yuppies, right? So Leiblich has been criticized for writing as an Ashkenazi woman, an academic, a daughter of the old elites who cares more about this mild Ashkenazi poverty than she does about the more severe and systemic poverty suffered by the underclass, Palestinian Israelis, Ethiopians, Haredim, etc. So should we be worried more when middle or upper middle class professionals feel poor than when regular poor people feel poor? New poverty can be thought of by Americans as the realization that you're going to be less financially secure than your parents, right? Who they tried to make sure you had all the tools to live at their standard of living or higher. So in Israel, the massive social protests of 2011 were basically an uprising of this new poor, people from educated, upwardly mobile households who had the sharp realization that the discrepancy between salaries and cost of living here meant that they are not going to live at their parents' level if they're lucky. So the protest started when a young video editor named Daphne Leaf, she got fed up after being priced out of her Tel Aviv apartment. She pitched a tent on Rothschild Boulevard with a few friends in protest, and it mushroomed into a protest of thousands all across the country. So you guys, does this new poverty represent a real new special social problem that we have to look at? Or is thinking of it as any different or worse poverty as the traditional kind sort of elitist and problematic?
No, I think it's actually very important because, first of all, the poverty line in Israel is very, very low. So there's a lot of people who are above the poverty line who are extremely poor, who are dealing with poverty on a daily basis. So the numbers, unfortunately, are much worse than the numbers that are publicized in my view. The people we're talking about are people who are experiencing downward mobility. Barbara Ehrenreich wrote a book in 1990, In America, Fear of Falling, which is the secret life of the middle class. People who feel like their standard of living is going to be worse than their parents, instead of better. Instead of everyone kind of constantly climbing up, something's going wrong. And people who feel like that you have a deep sense that the social contract is not working. You've done everything right. You went to school, you work hard, you're raising your family as best you can, and yet your prospects keep getting dimmer. Why does this matter? Because a liberal democracy needs a strong middle class. Without a strong middle class, liberal democracy is endangered, and we've seen that happen throughout history, leading to some pretty bad results.
I think that you're exactly right, and also, I think that this phenomenon of these poor people reflects some big structural change in Israel that is fearsome, that is troubling, and that I think the social protests set out to fight, and that we do need to fight, which is, what are the jobs of these people? I know at the university, we who are tenured professors, get lots of money. I mean, not lots of money, but we get enough money. And then adjunct teachers, the people who don't get into those good jobs, which are getting smaller and smaller, make basically usurious, terrible wages that are not living wages. So there are people who work in the public sector. They're social workers, and they're teachers in schools, and they're teachers in universities, and they're orderlies in hospitals. They're people that work in the public sector, and the public sector, Israel's economy has grown enormously over the past generation or 2 generations, but the public sector has not kept pace. And so people who decide to serve, last week we talked about diplomats, how diplomats don't make enough to buy a house in Israel. You can devote your life to being a diplomat in Israel, and you'll end up being poorer than everyone you went to school in. And so what the state is saying to people is, you devote yourselves to those helping positions that we fund because they are public goods, and you are damning yourself to a life of privation. And that is a terrible message, which is why I think these people are important, though not more important than the people who are going through the trash cans looking for food, but important in a different way.
I have a couple observations just having to do with kind of changing times and through the decades. I think that making a living in Israel was always very difficult. A lot of it was always we don't have really a rental economy here. You have to buy your apartment. A lot of buying your apartment has been predicated on getting help from your parents. So if your parents are barely, holding it together themselves, they can't give you money. It's also very much predicated on 2 incomes. There were never stay-at-home moms in Israel. No one could ever afford to have stay-at-home moms. You had to always have 2 people working. So as Israel's modernized and its rate of divorce has sort of started to keep up with the rest of the world, that is where it started to fall up, as this book observes, where it started to fall apart economically, particularly for the single mothers, and particularly when they're in so-called pink-collar professions, nurses or social workers, teachers,
and
et cetera.
add to that women get paid less than men in this country.
Absolutely.
That women make lower salaries for the same jobs. It's not different necessarily in the U.S., but this is a problem that has yet to be addressed. So that when you end up being a single mother, it's really a survival struggle. And then you start going down, leaving the middle class to poverty, and that's demoralizing beyond just the concrete issues.
So we're beginning to run out of time, but do either of you have any idea of how this ought to be addressed?
Well, I think it is serious, the question that I'll answer my own question of why it's important, because we are talking about a brain drain issue, because people now are very mobile and very aware of what their opportunities are elsewhere in the world. And if they can't hold it together in this country, we're going to have a drain, maybe not necessarily of these people she's describing, but they're going to encourage their children to leave the country and pursue greener pastures abroad.
Well, I think some of the things are implied in what you said before. Housing costs in this country are off the charts. So you have to create affordable housing also for the middle class. That is what the social protest was about. And for the lower classes here, because you cannot enter this housing market unless you know someone, you have family who can give you that nest egg. And we don't want to replicate the disastrous mortgage policies that allowed people to get the mortgages, but then it all collapsed and almost destroyed the global economy. So we don't want to do that. I think the other thing is you need to improve public sector salaries. You have to make them competitive. You're never going to attract, first of all, you're not going to attract the best and the brightest. And
so
you
they
can't
attract
get people
damn
living.
good people. The astonishing thing is there are so many people who are willing to work for no pay at all and no future. It's astonishing.
But they shouldn't be martyrs. And this is not a poor country anymore. Israel is not a country that doesn't have resources. It needs to reprioritize. It needs to say that a teacher is a necessity in this country. If I want our kids to be competitive in the global economy, I need to get the very best teachers. I need to pay them competitively so they won't go into high tech.
And it not being a poor country anymore is part of the problem, because we're used to, a gap between rich and poor, but now in the educated classes, and Israel's a small society, so everyone knows everybody, people that you grew up, went to school with, maybe even went to university with, one person hits the jackpot in high tech and is all of a sudden living on a certain level. Someone who might not feel so poor in the past is going to feel, on a relative scale poor. That's kind of a good problem to have, because it means that we also have the kind of wealth that makes people feel terrible about not having it.
And I'll just end by saying one thing. My family is now in a sort of low-level crisis, or a tizzy of trying to raise money. I was just with my parents, and they're trying to figure out how much money they can give, because we want to try to buy an apartment to take care of my wonderful daughter who just finished the army and is now teaching Jewish kids in Africa and then coming back to the university. And what's the crisis? Why do we need so much money? Because she has decided she wants to become a school teacher. And we want to be in a position where we can support her. And we're heartbroken at the thought that she could, with things being the way they are, she could never live in Tel Aviv and be a school teacher unless we somehow manage to win a lottery, rob a bank, or squeeze our parents, which is really the way we're going. And now listen to this.
את מסתבכת בדרכים לא סלולות, בונה לי מבוכים כאלה שקשה לי לקלוט. אם רק היית אומרת לי מה לעשות, הייתי רץ ברחוב בלילה מחפש מסיבות. כולם עובדים עכשיו, שמח זה מה שבטוח. כולם עובדים עכשיו, איתנו זה מה שבטוח. נשאר איתך, הרווחתי זה מה שבטוח.
That song is Kulam Rokdim Achshav by Voko Tikva. And now it's time for a second topic. So Don, lately some have argued that Jewish philanthropists should be showing a little less Rogerian unconditional love to Israel and a little more Lysistratian very conditional love. Do they have a point?
Well, the question really is, what do you do with philanthropy? What is it for? How does it impact Israel? David Rockefeller once observed that the purpose of philanthropy is to spur the basic innovations that transform society, not simply maintaining the status quo or filling basic social needs that were formerly the province of the public sector. So we could call that approach focus on innovation and change. Now, it was soon after the agreement about the Western Wall collapsed that Rabbi Daniel Gordis of the Shalem Center published a call to arms in a very different direction. He said to American Jews, you should use your wallets to go much further to punish Israel government when it betrays your positions, to strong-arm change in Israeli attitudes by destabilizing the government-ruling coalition. Gordis wrote, if American Jews cannot use financial pressure, they cannot create a coalition crisis, and they will lose. And then he gave an example. When Prime Minister Netanyahu appointed as Deputy Health Minister Yaakov Litzman from the ultra-Orthodox United Torah Judaism Party, a fierce opponent of Reform Judaism in Israel, Gordis said, and this is a quote, there has to be a price. Israeli hospitals survive in part thanks to American Jewish philanthropy. The flow of money should stop. Meetings with hospital fundraisers should be canceled. The hospitals did nothing wrong, but when they start running out of money, only then Israelis will start to care. Now, Gordis went as far as saying that we should punish Netanyahu personally. When their prime minister, he said, is publicly humiliated, when their prime minister is a publicly humiliated pariah, Israelis will begin to notice. Only then will American Jews and the religious pluralism they represent and a decent non-Haredi Judaism in Israel have a chance of winning. And he says we should disinvite Netanyahu from any events that he has been invited to previously. But he asks, are American Jews united enough? Do American Jews have the stomach to play hardball? I doubt it. But this is the Middle East, and that's how things work here. Let's call this the Gordis quid pro quo hardball approach. Now, let me add what I tell a lot of people when they complain about not getting grants, that no one is forcing major Jewish philanthropists or the $25 or $100 donor to a federation campaign to part with their money, let alone to direct it to Israel rather than to some worthy cause closer to home, or just to keep it. Even with all the tax breaks, you still have more money if you just don't give it away. Folks give money because they care about Israel, because they want to help people in need, because they want to affect change. So this raises a couple of questions which we will try to parse out right now. First, who or what needs help in Israel in 2018? Again, not a poor country. What are the levers of change that can be most effectively impacted by philanthropic dollars right now? And third, what about Gordis's challenge? Should the American Jewish community be demanding a quid pro quo? If the Israeli government continues to neglect or undermine reform and if the Israeli government, for example, continues to neglect or undermine reform and conservative Judaism in Israel, should leaders like Netanyahu be punished? What do you think?
Oh, wow. it's really hard to talk about this next to Don because he's practically an encyclopedia on the subject. But I'll just do my best. I'll point to, as a journalist, the one organization that I've covered that I think has made an intense impact and I'm continually impressed by is the reform movement's legal arm, Iraq, has really, really moved the lever in terms of really important issues. I mean, you guys hear about the wall, but also lesser discussed issues such as conversions, such as the mikvah, a story that I've been covering intensely since 2001, the women of Beit Shemesh who are fighting against modesty signs. Now, these are all modern Orthodox women, and yet the reform movement's legal arm has agreed to represent them. So Don can talk more about some of the educational efforts, because I definitely believe in theory that we're talking about grassroots and the things that groups like the one we're in front of right now are very valuable. But I think that the funding, the Israelis who are really standing up and putting up a fight and pushing for those things are the best investment for American Jews.
About Gordis's proposition, I am of two minds, and one mind says, hell yeah, I mean, people giving money have a right to decide how that money should be spent. And what's more, we in Israel desperately need moral perspectives that come from outside. And my other mind says, no, I mean, it's a little bit upsetting to think of entering a relationship that is so fundamentally at odds with one another. And also, presumably, there ought to be things that Israelis know about how to affect change in Israel that aren't clear from foreign shores. And so I'm of two minds about that. But as far as what I think should be done, I think, Allison, that I really fundamentally disagree with the approach of, I mean, Iraq is great. I don't have anything bad to say about Iraq, but the approach in saying let us fund people who are going to fight in an all-out war sort of way for the values that we want to advance, because Israel has reached a stage where it's us against them. I think what desperately is underfunded and is needed is to seek places that build a kind of common denominator. Like one area that I'm fascinated by, and I think is crucially important, is labor. Labor, there was a bus strike up in the north where Jews who normally vote for the Likud and Shas, these right-wing parties, and Palestinian Israelis were on the same side of a strike, working together day in, day out for social justice in a way that I think brings a kind of permanent political change that is the opposite. I wonder if Iraq doesn't deepen dissension and deepen differences.
Why not both? Why not both?
I think these are all very important battles to be fought, and I have no problem holding Netanyahu's feet to the fire if you feel like he's betraying a mission. I think American Jewish leaders have to stand up and say, we have positions we believe in, and it's not okay that you constantly claim that you're speaking for us, and yet you represent positions opposite to our positions. Some of those leaders are philanthropists, some of those leaders are not philanthropists, and there's a lot of philanthropy which is not necessarily political. I think that American Jews who have benefited so much from living in a liberal democracy, who feel more secure, I think, than any Jewish community outside of Israel in our history, have a special obligation to protect Israeli democracy, to say that the values that we believe in, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of press, these are ultimate values for here. Study after study shows Israelis do not have the same strong ties to these values. We assume everyone thinks that way, but it isn't true. So I think there's a special obligation for American Jews who have a different position to look at it. I'll just say, I think the biggest challenge is facing us today, and I know that you and the Federation are dealing with this all the time, and just from the names of the different subject areas and the different committees here you're addressing it, the biggest challenges I think facing us internally today are the tribalism and the income gaps. The correlation between socioeconomic status, for one example, and school outcomes is among the worst in the Western world. That's a place where American innovation can have a huge impact. You can find places that are levers to try to promote social mobility. And I think in this area, the clock is ticking because we do not want to create permanent underclasses in this country. We didn't used to have them because everybody sort of was in the lower middle class in this country. But in the last 30, 40 years, that's completely flipped. It's still possible to change that. And I think this is one place that American Jewish philanthropy can play a very central role.
Our time is almost up. I think that as you know, Don, I have very ambivalent feelings about the fight for democracy. I'm all in favor of democracy. I think it's great. But I think that there is a kind of misunderstanding, and that Israelis are actually much better at democracy than one might learn listening to just the sounds of its most vocal critics. And so I feel nervous about people coming from abroad saying, we will teach you democracy. I think that could also...
No, I think it's supporting local efforts. I mean, there's a lot of efforts that are here. There's a lot of people here that are starved for funding, who need help, are looking for support. And there's a lot of money coming in on sides which I find oppressive. You want to build a shared society, you need funding to build that society. You need to fund the local actors who are trying to do that, not to come in, and say, we know better than you.
I think it has to do with listening and not just talking, with actually, finding out where the momentum is in the Israeli society. My example is however much that American Jews care about the Western Wall issue on the religion state side. If you look at what's going on right now in the city of Ashdod, where secular people are fighting for the right to go shopping on Saturday. Now that may not sound so meaningful to an American Jew, but there is an alliance to be built there in religion state between Americans who care about part of the equation and Israelis who care about a different part.
Allison is talking about listening, and I'm holding up the sign that says, please shut the fuck up.
And I'm ignoring him, which, that's...
Now listen to this.
בשובך יחזור שוב האור בעיניי לא גם הוא לא עושה במגע בידייך שיבוא ויעיר נשמע כל צחוקי נקראתי אלייך בואי בשובך שוב האור בעיניי.
That song is a really beautiful mashup of Idan Reichel songs. You should look for it on YouTube. It's performed by Voca Tikva, Israel's premier purveyor of a cappella social music. And now it is time for our third topic, which we are calling Still in All, Israel. And here's why. Still in all is what my bubby used to say, still in all. I have told this story before because its impact on me personally is huge. Not long before I moved to Israel, I met an old American expatriate in Moscow. Like so many others, I'd been sent by a group called SSSJ, which existed back then, the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, when the Soviet Union existed. And I was on a college Christmas break, and I had been sent to bring prayer books and blue jeans to Jews who had been denied exit visas, refuseniks, to emigrate to Israel. The pants were for resale on the black market because Jews who requested visas were then stripped of their jobs and they were forced to scrabble. In 10 days, I met dozens of these refuseniks, and the expatriate guy who I mentioned at the beginning, he stood out. His parents had lived in Flatbush, my grandparents' old neighborhood. They followed news of the Russian Revolution in its time with great excitement, he told me. And by the time the expatriate was 5 years old in 1920, living in America had become unbearable to his parents. America was to them some soulless Babylon where money and trivial comforts were all that mattered. To raise a boy in America, his parents concluded, was to sentence that boy to a hollow life of a petty shopkeeper at best. But to raise a boy in revolutionary Russia, that would give him a future that had meaning and that had honor. His parents sold their books and sold their furniture, bought steerage tickets on a steamer bound for Le Beau. From there, they made their way to Moscow, where they took up residence in a tiny third-floor apartment that they shared with 2 other families. And it was in that same apartment 60 years later that the expatriate gratefully took the Levi's that I brought him and told me in Brooklyn English that his well-meaning parents had destroyed his life before it had even started. Failing to see the Soviet Union for what it was or what it would be, I guess, they had landed him in a nightmare from which he could never awake. So I think about this very often. My girl just completed her Army service 6 months ago. My boy was just inducted into the infantry in November. These days, when I look at them, I find myself thinking about my choice and my wife's to live in Israel, which seemed to make a whole lot of sense a few decades ago, but now maybe less so. In the recent season of Transparent, for those of you who watched it, Ali escapes from the lush lawns of the Tel Aviv Hilton for what she sees as the at least morally intelligible camaraderie that she finds among Palestinian activists in a commune near Ramallah. And even her less woke family members feel fearful and alien when they find themselves on a Jewish settlement in the West Bank. What can this possibly have to do with me? Each of them wonders. So around Rosh Hashanah, the dyspeptic Haaretz columnist Rogel Alfer wrote an essay called Why I Am Leaving the Country. He writes this essay every year, in which he explains that Israel, quote, Israel is not worth the price it extracts from us. That is the truth. I cannot justify to my children continuing to live here. It is impossible to live a good life here. It is possible to die here, or it is possible simply to leave. A couple of years ago, a 25-year-old from Ramat Gan named Naor Narkis opened a Facebook page called Olim Le Berlin. We are moving or ascending to Berlin, and tens of thousands of young Israelis joined the page and said that they were ready to pack their bags, many explaining that they just lost the simple faith in Israel, that Israel was a good place to live or a good place at all. So we 3 have our criticisms of Israel as well, as you've heard. And we have our worries, especially about the future of the country and therefore about our own future, and I think mostly about the future of our kids. Yet we are here. We are raising our kids here. Each of us now has a kid in the Army, not just me. So my question for you, Mooks and Mopes, are these. How do we harmonize between our criticisms of Israel and our worries about the future and the fact that we made this place our home by choice, and effectively each day we make that choice anew?
Well, I'm a little bit different from my cohorts here because I did not grow up in a particularly Zionist household, just as it was not a particularly religious household. I found myself here on junior year abroad, and I caught the Israel bug. And then later on in life, as many of my fellow American Jews who live here happened, I married an Israeli who miraculously wanted to actually live in their homeland and not get a green card. He turned down the opportunity to get a green card. So part of it was circumstance. Also, as a journalist, there's always a great story here, et cetera, which is another reason why I like being here. But I think back to my 19-year-old self, why I caught the bug, and that gut feeling of, wow, look around me, what's going on. And like I said, didn't come from a particularly Jewish background, so I wasn't so turned on by the Jewishness. But my definition of being Jewish until the moment I came to Israel, was about a lot of the Holocaust, and everyone was talking then about Jewish continuity, keeping the community together. It felt a lot about the past and history and tradition, which is all well and nice, but when you're 19 years old, it only gets you so far. What I saw about Israel then was being part of something new, being part of building a future, creating things that had not been there before. And as a young person, that really turned me on. And now I have to say, as an older person, that's also really, I think, what keeps me here, and the difference that I feel in going back and forth, which I do a lot. That's the special sauce here, is that you feel like, for better and for worse, and often it's for worse, something new, dynamic, revolutionary, historic is happening here, and I just want to be part of it.
Well, that's wonderful. I just want to add, Don, I want to hear from you, but about the Holocaust, which you mentioned, I just wanted to add, it's apparently not Poland's fault at all, just so we know. Okay. Oh, so they're not Polish death camps? Okay. Don?
Well, look, I did grow up in a very Zionist home, Camp Ramah, Young Judea, Tel Yehuda boy, so I had deep Zionist roots. My father, grandparents belonged to the Labor Zionist Alliance, the Verband. So I'd been hearing this my whole life on some level, though my parents were totally freaked out when I made Aliyah. And then afterwards, I realized, oh my God, my parents are 7,000 miles away. So they're not going to be part of my daily life. So we actually gave up, on both sides, gave up quite a bit to fulfill this dream. But I had a very clear sense that I live in a particular historical moment. And that Israel, which came into being a decade before I came into being, is a miracle. And I was aware enough of the Six-Day War to realize that it was another miracle. And so there was clearly a sense that there's a moment to be part of it, and if I'm going to be part of it, I have this opportunity, and why would I pass it up? Now, that doesn't get you through reading the newspaper and getting enraged at every headline. That doesn't carry you through the daily struggle of things that disturb me, that scare me about the direction of the country, about attitudes here, about behavior here. The whole discussion about the refugees makes me completely crazy that a Jewish state would treat refugees like this and then do cartwheels in the air to find justifications for it. Makes me insane. But the fact that it makes me insane is the reason I stay here. Because things that disturb me in the United States, that's really bad, and I found my cause here or there. But I didn't feel the same urgency, A, that I had to do something about it. I have to do something about it, or B, that I could do something about it. Doesn't mean we've discovered, all of us have discovered how hard it actually is to affect change any place, but also in Israel. But I think that immediacy is what doesn't let me go.
I just have to jump in here and say, that feeling of your government making you insane, I don't think my American friends really understood what that felt like until the last few years. And now finally, I think that they can relate.
Well, I think that I'm in a way a much easier position than what you described, Don, though I certainly understand what you're saying, and I feel that too. The passion with which one feels connected that drives the degree to which we're upset about this place is something beautiful and rare and valuable, which I love about being here. But I'm in the happier position of feeling like really the most deeply buried lead in the history of the world is the fact that Israel has, in the time that I've been here since the 1980s, become a much better place, not worse. And we wring our hands, and I'm not opposed to, I'm in favor of the wringing. I do the hand wringing because we want this place to be the place that we want it really to be, including for our kids. But when I came in the 1980s, it was illegal for a Jew to talk to somebody in the PLO. People were arrested for doing that. 20% of Israelis believe that in some distant future they could possibly support a two-state solution, and now the majority in every poll believes that that's true. That was a time when you had to be an Ashkenazi male to have a voice in this society at all, and now the Knesset has more women than ever and more Mizrahim than ever. Really, by any metric that I choose, the country is so much better than the country that I came to and fell in love with. So for me, that's easy. And I would just add one anecdote. I went, before everyone went into the army, we all took a trip, my family, to Paris, and my kids went to a school for the arts through their whole academic career, through their whole career through high school. And we went to the Museum d'Orsay, and I loosed my two children into all that amazing art. And you know how, if you're a parent, you live to see the pupil in your children's eyes widen with that wow, that awe. And my daughter's eyes widened, and she ran from picture to picture, many of which she knew from her education. And she was so happy, but more than that, she was so at home in the world. This little Israeli girl who, in the fullness of time, would go on to read Torah at the wall in her army uniform, at part of the army. She was so at home in the world, at home with the art, at home in Paris, in a way that I had dreamed that Zionism could make me feel, but never did. And the Jewish people had dreamed that Zionism could make the Jewish people feel. And there it was in this kid, in this moment. And I see it all the time. And it's so fragile and so incredibly beautiful. And it's something that is the loveliest thing that I've ever seen in my life. And that is a product of this country.
And while we're talking about children, I mean, this is an amazing place to raise
now
children.
it's the quelling part
No,
of the program.
that's going to be in my What a Country. I'm
Yeah.
saving that for in a few minutes. But this is a very family-centered society. This is a place where at work, if somebody's sick or someone has to go to a funeral, it's taken for granted that you miss work, that takes priority. My brother-in-law, when he was studying on the northern border in a college, used to drive home every Friday to eat Shabbat dinner with the extended family for 2 hours because we live in Kfar Saba in the center of the country, and drive back 2 hours because he wouldn't miss Friday night dinner. He wouldn't have that. That could not be part of his week. So things like that, I think are amazing. And again, the day-to-day life here is wonderful. You can do pretty well if you don't read the newspaper and stay in a much happier mood. But we have to also pay attention to the other things going on.
And we're going to have to leave it at that unless you have a last word, Allison. And
No, just, what we were talking about, you hear about these religion state wars in Israel. Even in the most secular part of Israel, from 6 to 8 p.m. on a Friday night, you can almost hear a pin drop. Even the most secular, hip, cool, young kid is at home having Shabbat dinner with their family. And, Jewish, not Jewish, family-oriented, etc. There is a sense of togetherness in a very Jewish way. People are in each other's face in the bad way too, but also in the good way. And I really feel that sort of bond, togetherness, and lack of alienation that you feel in some other parts of the world. So it's part of what makes this country really special, as well as really annoying at times.
And now listen to this.
הקרניים נשלחות, אראה לך כמה שפחות, משקפי שמש בקבוק שלוף, מורח בו את כל הגוף, למרות שאת כה מטריפה, אני לא מוכן לחשיפה, גם מתחת לשמיים.
That song is Chacham Bashemesh by Voko Tikva. And now it's time for our What a Country segment. This is the part of the show in which each of us describes something that might have surprised or amused, delighted or enchanted, ensorcelled or maybe even fluged us as we wended our way through our worlds over the last little while. So Don, what is your What a Country?
Well, this week, my son Yaniv became an officer in the Israel Defense Forces. He deserves that. Yaniv stood in the last row of the company in the rear, so we watched the ceremony from a side balcony where we could see him clearly among the other 600 new officers in the huge inner courtyard parade ground at the officers' training facility under the bright winter sun of the Negev desert. They kept in formation, occasionally presenting arms, but mostly standing still. I studied my son down below, upright and attentive, keeping his eyes forward even while those nearby peeked around in responses to shout-outs from friends, or relaxed while their officers pinned onto their collars their pins that they are now officers. Let me take that again. I studied my son down below, upright and attentive, keeping his eyes forward even while those near him peeked around in response to shout-outs from friends, or relaxed while getting their officer pins pinned onto their collars by their instructors and commanders. Observing him from this vantage point set my mind racing to the family chain that led us here. My grandparents' and great-grandparents' decisions 120 years ago to leave Russia, to leave Poland, to leave Austria, to go to America. My parents sending me to Camp Ramah when I was 9, right after the Six-Day War, taking me to Israel when I was 11 to see a brand new country covered with dust, and sending me to Young Judea Camp, which ultimately led me to marry an Israeli and make Aliyah. And how when I came to Israel, it was my wife's younger brother Tzach at the same officers training program, and here the torch was passed to the next generation. And despite being raised in our household, which honored military service but never emphasized it, Yaniv is going above and beyond in his IDF commitment, now extended to 5 years instead of 32 months. It was not Yaniv's ability to stand still in the parade ground that made me so proud, but listening to him afterward, tell me how he's looking forward to being responsible for other soldiers, how it'll be more challenging, how it'll be more demanding. And the bigger picture, which he will see more clearly now, the bigger picture is always more interesting, Abba, always more exciting. He is living the words that jut out in metallic letters on the rear wall of the giant parade ground beneath 6 flowing Israeli flags. Mimeni tir'u v'ken ta'asu. Watch me and do the same. A quote from the book of Judges, when Gideon prepares his assembled forces to fight the Midianites. The trainees were invited to share feedback, and Yaniv told us how he offered a detailed critique to his commanders of what they did right and wrong throughout the training course. But unlike some of the other soldiers who were frustrated or disappointed, he did it with no anger, with no bitterness, and with a lot of appreciation, and he noticed that his comments were well received. His nature is always to assume the best intention, and that positivity is often reflected back. His instructors told me he's an exemplary leader, that they were privileged to have him, but they wanted me to know that he kept them laughing throughout the training, and that he volunteered to give a whole bunch of fascinating lectures, including one which he delivered impromptu when a speaker canceled at the last minute. So I saw this tall and outgoing and gorgeous boy who loves to lead and learn, so funny and bright and warm, and in some ways like my wife Shira and myself, and unlike us in so many ways. And it's not pride exactly, that's too mundane a word. It's that sense of ourselves extending outward, upward, into Israel and into the world in wondrous and unpredictable ways.
That was beautiful, Don. You should also, when you have the chance, meet Don's other 2 children. But that was beautiful, Don. You're a crybaby, of course, but that was beautiful. Allison, what is your better country?
Yeah, follow that, right? So on Friday, my husband's extended family got together to celebrate the 79th birthday of its matriarch, my mother-in-law, Helene, who was born to Polish immigrant parents in Strasbourg, France, before the Second World War. She saw her father taken away by the Nazis, never to return, and she grew up as the child of a struggling widow single mother who sold clothes in the local market to support the family. As a little girl, she told her Catholic teachers that she didn't believe in God. Shocked and horrified, they asked her why. She said if there was a God, her father wouldn't have been taken away from her. They couldn't really respond to that. Later in life, however, she changed and, taken under the wing of her local rabbi, began to live an Orthodox Jewish life, much to the dismay of her mother, who needed her to sell clothes in the market on Saturday. She joined Bnei Akiva, where she met my father-in-law, who came from an established French family in Paris, and the 2 young Zionists married and made their way to Israel, a journey that she made in her 8th month of pregnancy with my husband. So determined was she to give birth in the Jewish homeland. I tell her she was crazy not to have done it in a civilized Paris hospital, but what can you say when people are idealistic? So that's how I ended up being married to a real Sabra, because of that sacrifice she made. But the focus of my What a Country isn't Helene's life story, but her deep love for the outdoors and for nature, both in Europe where she grew up and now here in Israel, which is how we found ourselves throwing a birthday party for her, not in a fancy restaurant, but on the border of the Gaza Strip. Yes, literally a stone's throw away, no pun intended, from Gaza. Why in the world would we schlep down there when there's plenty of beautiful natural sights to see around where we live? They're from Jerusalem, we're from the center of the country. We've got plenty of nice parks near us. Well, we went all the way down there for the same reason that thousands of Israelis make that pilgrimage there every year for the first few weeks in February or the last weeks of January to enjoy the country's favorite flower. My mother-in-law, like so many others, adores the blooming of wildflowers, and especially kalaniot. In English, or I don't even think it's English, anemones. I hope I pronounced it right in English. One of the few cases where the Hebrew is easier to pronounce than the English. Kalaniot begin to spring up this time of year, and if you come at the right time, you can view a dramatic bright red carpet of flowers spreading across southwestern Israel. The southern kibbutzim and moshavim around Gaza near Sderot have a festival of red with food and special events. There's a lot of wordplay going on because the code word for rocket attacks from Gaza salsa is the color red, and so that makes a very complicated relationship with the color. Now, when I say Israelis love their wildflowers, I mean they love them. There are even websites that will update you with wildflower updates, what's blooming where. Even in wartime, when the rockets are flying, people are willing to take their risks to check out the kalaniot. How do I know that the kalanit is Israel's #1 favorite flower? Can I prove scientifically that it's the country's very favorite? In fact, I can. In 2013, the Society for the Protection of Nature held an online poll to choose Israel's favorite flower. Kalaniot won with 28% of the vote. Second place went to the rakefet, the cyclamen, with 23%, and the purple iris trailed far behind with 12% of the vote. That poll took place in honor of SPNI's 60th anniversary and marked 48 years since the organization launched its campaign to preserve Israel's wildflowers. Now, if you know Israelis, you know that following rules are not their forte. But there was a successful campaign the government held in 1963 to teach Israelis not to pick wildflowers and treat them like a national treasure instead. In the very early years of the state, picking the flowers, putting them in the homes, making crowns of flowers, pressing them in memory books, that was a big thing. And the school that picked the most flowers, they even would win a prize. But suddenly, the country woke up. They realized if they pick them, they won't have them anymore, and they were saved from extinction by first being made illegal. The Society of Protection of Nature first had to go to Moshe Dayan, then the agriculture minister, to get the law through in 1963. The real challenge was getting people to obey. They printed posters, hung them everywhere, army bases, schools, post offices, and it was a hit. So it's a great story. They changed song lyrics about picking flowers to song lyrics about appreciating flowers. So it was a very successful PR advertising campaign that if it hadn't worked, the country not known for restraint hadn't learned to restrain itself 50 years ago, then we wouldn't have had the red carpets of flowers in the South that we were able to enjoy for my mother-in-law's birthday celebration.
Hear, hear. So mine is this. After Shabbat ended last night, I got an email from a friend of mine and of Don's, Mike Berman, that read in its entirety, man of culture, single man. We have a spare ticket to Shalom Chanoch tonight, 10 p.m., Hangar 11, interested in joining us. And my reply read in its entirety, yes, I would. I was single because Susan is in Mbale, Uganda, visiting the girl. And if you're looking for an adage to live your life by, never turn down a chance to see Shalom Chanoch is, in my book, a fine one. But in the event last night was more than just a Shalom Chanoch concert. The evening was dedicated to performing the first two of Chanoch's albums, both from 1970, both made with the late Arik Einstein. Chanoch and Einstein met when Chanoch was still in the army in 1967, and he began to play as an opening act for Einstein's first group, a legendary group called HaChalonot HaGvohim, in clubs in Tel Aviv. Chanoch and Einstein became friends, spending their idle cash and their idle time on records from England and America, and they said that they could feel rock and roll coming to Israel. In 1970, they made these two records, they're called Shablul and Plastilina, that captured what they heard on those imported records and Israelified it, filling it with a kind of marbleization of both pathos and joy. Here, listen to this.
יש לי הרבה לאהוב מראש, יש לי תמיד חברים שעוזרים לשמוח. תן לצחוק, תן ללמוד, תן לצחוק ותן לשמוע. תן לחיות ותן לטעות, תן לעצמך לסלוח, פשוט לאהוב.
Now, 15 years would pass before I fell in love with Shalom Chanoch. In 1985, I was in the army, and he released a bitter but brilliant record under the influence of the war in Lebanon and of the hyperinflation and the economic crisis. The record was called Mechakim LaMashiach, whose title song became an obsession in my unit, like in every unit in the army. we would sing it over and over again at guard duty at night. The Messiah isn't coming and the Messiah isn't phoning either. But the Shalom Chanoch that we saw last night was nothing like that bitter Shalom Chanoch who first ensorcelled me. Chanoch last night was a man in love, first of all, with his friend Arik Einstein, whom, when he died 4 years ago, was accompanied to his funeral by tens of thousands of Tel Avivim, and mourned by millions who also loved him. The first words Chanoch said last night when he came to the stage was, Arik is everywhere in this room. He is filling this room. And throughout the evening, tracks of Arik Einstein's voice were played, tracks of him singing, and Chanoch sang along with him. Shalom Chanoch also invited two younger singers to perform with him. Peter Roth, the star of a famous Cholon band called Monica Sachs, and a woman who's, Peter Roth, the star of a famous Cholon band called Monica Sachs, who sounds sweetly like Arik Einstein, and Marina Maximilian, a Ukrainian-born singer who went to my kids' high school and became famous on a reality TV singing contest, and who sings with a power that makes you shudder. The result was something very different from nostalgia, which is what I expected. It was maybe the opposite of nostalgia. The result was a feeling that Einstein and Chanoch had started something fragile and beautiful 48 years ago that had, in the interim, only grown stronger and more beautiful. The result was the feeling that Israel so often produces of old somehow becoming young and young becoming old, of the past being renewed and the present being drawn back and yoked to what came before it. On the screen behind the stage, they showed clips of Arik Einstein in a famous old movie called Mitzitzim, which was filmed on the beach just off the port where the concert took place. And he in the movie was young and he was beautiful, running through broken down streets. And when we poured out into the evening chill after the concert ended, we were on those same streets exactly, and they were shiny and they were flashy and they were built new with cafes and stores and offices and homes. And all of us herding out of that dark hall, we too, to me, seemed young and beautiful and ready for another 48 years. And that brings us to the end of our show. Thank you to Gizem Azdemir, our very talented engineer, for making this show and every show happen. Thanks to Amit Ashkenazi, our brilliant offshore researcher in the Netherlands. Thanks to all the folks who created TLV1 and with the sweat of their brow keep it going with such vision and energy. That's Itai Shelem, and that's Avner and Lior Shelem, who are here with us tonight. Thanks to all the folks here at UJ Federation of New York for inviting us, and in a broader sense for all the stuff that you do for the Jewish people. We're grateful. I feel I can speak for the Jewish people. Thanks to Ashibolim, my very favorite band from Kibbutz Geva. They give us the music at the start and the end of our show. Thanks to everyone who supports us through Patreon. You make it possible for us to do what we do. If you're not yet a Patreon supporter, please consider lending a hand, which you can do by searching for us at patreon.com. We'll be forever in your debt. Thank you, Natalie Portman. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Don. Thanks to the rest of you out there for taking the time to listen. We also want to ask you to like us on Facebook and drop us a line. We're going to answer. Then go to Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star review, maybe one that begins with this. The Promise Podcast is arguably the only podcast where in one place you can truly meet all your Einstein needs, from Albert to Arik. ... Finish that any way you want. But before you do that, this week on February 13th, we will celebrate what most consider to be the most important day of the year, World Radio Day, so stipulated by the United Nations in recognition of the fact that, quote, radio is still the most dynamic, reactive, and engaging medium there is, providing the diversity of views and voices needed to address the challenges we all face, end quote. Yet, after a whole year of waiting for World Radio Day to come, it will pass like a flash. It always does. And then not return for 12 long months. Not so, the Promise Podcast. We'll be back for you next week and every week, filling the airwaves with dynamic, reactive, and engaging jibber-jabber on this, the Promise Podcast.